Before we begin, there are no spoilers. This isn't a recap. I'm not narrating plot or revealing twists or walking you through the ending. What I'm doing is theology and cultural reading of the show and asking the question of what kind of moral world does Stranger Things assume? And what does it quietly, therefore, assume about the church inside that world? And just to say again, because people may get jumpy, is I'm not doing Netflix bad. I'm not doing Hollywood hates Jesus. That's not what this is. And also, this is part two. If you haven't watched part one, which is called Stranger Things Has a Theology of Evil, but Where is the Church? I genuinely recommend it because part one lays down the foundations of what kind of evil the show thinks exists and why the church's absence is one of the loudest things on screen. It could be said, really, that part one is about what evil is in this show, and part two is about the church's absence and what that does to the children and to fear and to meaning. And today I'm not relaying those foundations. I'm hoping to build on them. And the way we're going to do that is not by arguing in general terms. It's not the church should have done this and society used to be like that. And it's not even a lecture about the decline of the West, but I want to do it by looking at two children and one worldview. The children are Holly and Derek, and the worldview is the anti-creed that sits underneath Vecna, because this is where the question becomes personal. And it's not when questions aren't personal when adults debate institutions, but it is personal when children are afraid at night or fearful. When I say anti-creed, I'm not trying to be clever. What I mean is this, because a creed is the bit where the faith says, this is what's real, this is what a human being is, this is what good is, this is what evil is, and this is what saves you. And the anti-creed is the same thing, but the only difference is it doesn't admit it's doing it. It doesn't stand up and say, here's what we believe, like you might in a Church of England church on Sunday morning when you read the creed. It just builds a moral world where certain things are sacred, certain things are unforgivable, and certain people are innocent by definition, and therefore certain people are monsters also by definition. So it isn't a lack of belief. It's kind of belief with the label peeled off. And once you spot that, you stop treating the story like it's just entertainment. You realize the story itself is catechizing you, albeit quietly. Okay, so that's what I mean by anti-creed. The quickest way to find out what any community actually worships is to watch what it offers the vulnerable when the lights go out. And in Stranger Things, I'm not meaning that poetically, I mean it literally. The hallway light, the edge of the bed, the mum, the dad, and the bit where a child's brave face collapses. And just to say, if this is this kind of slow, careful theological analysis and Christian history is your thing, then please like the video. It would genuinely help get it out to the right people. And also, if you want more of this, then please do subscribe to the channel. I'm putting videos up every week, and I really would love you to stick around. One of the quiet structural truths of Stranger Things is that the kids are doing two jobs. They fight evil, but also they interpret that same evil. They carry meaning before the town has permission to believe anything is happening. They hold reality when the adults are still clinging on to this sort of normalcy. And a story can do that for a while, but eventually, as we see in the show, the original kids grow up. They don't just grow up in height and but in symbolic weight, because children are not merely small adults in a moral imagination or in a theological imagination. Children are actually a category, because children are vulnerability and dependence, and the ones who, can't pull themselves together, and the ones who don't have the language yet, and the ones who reveal whether your world has any real shelter for them built into it. So when a story about apocalypse reaches its later stages, it almost always seems to return to children, but not for sentiment or anything like that, but for judgment. And I know when we think of apocalypse, it sounds like explosions, but I mean the older meaning, the unveiling and the revealing and the truth coming out. It reveals what a society truly is, and what it truly is gets revealed in how it protects, or in some cases fails to protect, the powerless. So yes, the new children matter. Maybe that's why they get so much screen time, not because the writers got bored and not because they needed fresh faces, but because the story is trying to do something sharper at this point. It's asking, this evil is not just the private nightmare anymore of one friendship group. This is what Hawkins itself has become. And the question is no longer only, can the heroes win? It's, does this place have anything sturdy left? Does it have any moral backbone, any spiritual nerve, and any presence that can carry fear without turning it into blame? And I think that's why Holly matters, and also why Derek matters, because Holly is the child you instinctively want to protect. And Derek is the child your instincts might treat initially as a problem. And how a community handles these two types tells you almost everything. Okay, let's do a very quick 30-second bridge from part one, just so that we're standing on the same ground. Because in part one, I argued three basic things. I said that Stranger Things treats evil as real and not merely as a misunderstanding or a metaphor, that the upside down works as like an anti-creation. It is a hollowed out parody of real life. And the loudest absence in the show is the church, not as a building, but as a credible category of response, of prayer and ritual and confession and presence and mercy and steadiness. Let me slow down a little bit on that final point, because this is where people may mishear me. I'm not saying there aren't church buildings in Hawkins. There are. And I'm not pretending they don't exist. And I'm saying that the church is not imagined as practical help. It's not the place you go when fear hits you, nor is it the place you go when your kids can't sleep, or even the place you go when you need mercy more than being lectured. And that difference is the important point, because I think that's probably enough information to understand this video, because today we ask, what happens to a town when the absence persists long enough that children have to live inside that absence? I'm actually going to just use a phrase that even I find annoying, but I think it tells us where we're at. The phrase is spiritual vacuum. I don't mean nobody believes in God, and I don't mean there aren't churches on the map, and I don't even mean that people aren't religious, but a spiritual vacuum is where the space where something weighty should be gets filled with much thinner substitutes. When catastrophe comes and your deepest words don't function anymore, when a community has religious vocabulary but no religious depth, in a spiritual vacuum, people still talk about good and evil. They just talk about them in the wrong register. They replace evil is real with let's manage behavior, and they replace pastoral care with suspicion. They can also replace mercy with a hunt for the bad guys. And here's the bit I really mean. They teach their children that this is what being serious looks like. So Holly and Derek aren't just side characters, they are evidence. And they show us what Hawkins is handing down to the next generation. Holly matters early on because I think she is maybe domestic life. She's been visible in early series. She's part of the town that still wants to believe that bedtime is safe, that homework is normal, and that childhood is a protected category. She represents this fragile hope that the world still has structure. And at the moment you center a child like Holly, you're forced to ask the question that's no longer theoretical. You've got to ask, when a child is terrified, where does a town send her? You're not asking, well, what policy do we have or who's in charge? I mean, where does she go? Where does she go emotionally, and where does she go spiritually when that fear hits her? What does a community offer that is not merely practical, but also steady and consistent? Because children can survive more than we think, but they cannot survive meaninglessness. Children need something sturdier than adrenaline. They need a frame big enough for fear. And historically, at its best, that's what the church offered. It didn't offer answers for everything, and it didn't offer this instant rescue, but a way of being held inside terror without having to turn terror into something shameful. Let me say that again, really, because this is the point where I think modern life has genuinely forgotten something. The church's pastoral gift is not primarily explanation, it's presence, it's just being present. It's the refusal to let the afflicted become the suspects. It's the capacity to say, this is happening to you. This is not proof that you are dirty. This is not your fault. This does not mean you have been abandoned. And one of the oldest tools Christianity has for doing that is a distinction that modern communities often lose. It's understanding the difference between affliction and guilt, and the difference between suffering endured and evil done, an attack versus responsibility, and victimhood versus blame. When that distinction is clear, a child can be protected. When it collapses, maybe a child suffers twice, first from the terror itself, and then from the community that needs to make terror somebody's fault. So Holly could be seen as a theological test, not because she gives a speech about God, she doesn't, but because her existence asks, is there anywhere in this town where fear is met with mercy rather than management? And if the answer is no, then that vacuum doesn't stay empty. It fills with substitute liturgies, because friendship becomes a form of sacrament, and music becomes the exorcism, and memory replaces prayer, and then naming something becomes an anchor. And those things are beautiful, and the show is right to honor them. But their beauty is also an indictment, because they're doing the job the church historically did when catastrophe came. The original kids are brave, but they're also initiated. They've seen enough to know what they're facing. They have networks and they have a shared language and they have a kind of earned competence. And the new children don't have that. New children is what the town is producing now. They show whether Hawkins really has learned anything or whether Hawkins is simply passing down panic in a different form. Holly is the new child who shows what must be protected. But Derek is the new child that shows what fear produces when that protection fails. When Derek first arrives, he arrives with a certain energy. He's not framed as noble and he's not framed as wise. He's rough and rude and a bully. And that matters because in a spiritual vacuum, bullying is not just personal nastiness. It becomes a way of coping, a way of organizing the world, and a way of turning fear into control. A frightened community doesn't always teach children rules. It teaches them how to handle dread. And if the only spiritual language left in place is suspicion and moral management, then children learn it early on. They will convert their insecurity into dominance. They might convert vulnerability into contempt, and they can learn that mocking someone makes you feel much less afraid. So Derek is not merely a bad kid, he's a symptom, and he's what you get when a town's moral ecosystem teaches survival is control. And here's where it gets really human, because at some point we start to like Derek, not because bullying becomes good, it doesn't, but because the show takes his rough, defensive energy and turns it outward and towards the thing that actually deserves contempt. It's a strange little shift. The kid who used to punch down finally learns what it means to punch up. It's not a form of sanctification and it's not holiness, but it is a moral change. It suggests that Derek isn't just cruel, he's fearful and seeking a target and learning briefly to aim it in the right place. And that's exactly where the church should have been able to speak. Because Christianity knows how to tell the truth about sin without turning the sinner into this temporary, disposable system. Christianity knows, or should know, that moral failure and affliction often intertwine. That does not excuse cruelty, but it changes how you respond to it. A church that remembers the gospel should be the institution least interested in scapegoating a child. And I think I need to interlude here and say something plainly, because if I don't, somebody will quite rightly say it for me. Churches have scapegoated people too. Churches have blamed victims, and churches have turned fear into righteousness, and sometimes they have done those things violently. So I'm not romanticizing the church. I'm saying that when the church forgets the gospel, it becomes part of the panic. And when it remembers the gospel, it becomes the one place that can resist that same panic. But in a vacuum, scapegoating becomes irresistible. And Derek is the kind of child moral panics love, because he is socially available, isn't he? He's mouthy and unpleasant and easy to label. So if a town is trained to interpret disorder as maybe defiance, then Derek types are always at risk of becoming the proof that evil is here. And that's the next development, because once you bring Derek into the frame, you're forced to ask, does this town know how to deal with a difficult child without turning him into either a villain or a mascot? And if it doesn't, then the vacuum is deep. Now, we need to bring Vecna back in, not as mythology, but as theology, because the show isn't merely fighting a monster, it's fighting a worldview. And this is where I want to say something that does have a feel or resemblance of important, because Vecna doesn't only tempt by pleasure, he tempts by interpretation, because he offers an explanation big enough to hold pain, and then he poisons it. He tells you your pain is truth, love is a lie, weakness is deception, freedom comes through severing bonds. And that's not merely sort of a villainous dialogue. This is an anti-creed. And here's why this is important, because if the enemy is false meaning, you don't only need weapons, you need a counter story. You need a true account of what suffering is and what evil is, what love is, and what salvation is. And Christianity's counter story is not, we are good people. It's, we are the people who needed mercy. Which means the church should be the one institution in town most resistant to panic when it gets given the holy label of righteousness. But in a world of stranger things, when religion appears, it often appears as performance, as identity and crowd reassurance, and has a negative vocabulary. So the real battle here is not only between kids and monsters, it's between two gospels. One that says your pain is truth, sever bonds, be alone and become hardened. And one that says your pain is real, but it's not the whole truth, and that love is not a lie, and that communion matters and mercy is stronger than accusation. And when the church is not credible, that second gospel still appears. But it appears through different mediums, through friendship and memory and sacrifice, rather than through an institution that's trained to carry it. And this is where we find stranger things in a vacuum again. So let's put it together. Holly is vulnerability exposed, and Derek is sort of vulnerability armored. Because Holly asks, where do I go when I'm afraid? And Derek asks, even if he doesn't know he's asking it actually, what do I do with fear if nobody shows me how to carry it? And Vecna's anti-creed offers an answer to both of them. To Holly, he says, you're alone. And to Derek, become dangerous. And the question for the church, and if anyone goes to church who's watching this, is not primarily, do we disapprove of Netflix? The question is, could anyone imagine us as credible help? Could anyone imagine us as a place where fear is met with mercy, where suffering is not moralized, where confession is not weaponized, and where prayer is not theater? Because when those things fail, children become the carriers of meaning, and children should never have to carry that much meaning alone. Let's be practical and historically honest. I'm not saying a church would fix the upside down. That would be silly. But historically, in moments of plague and war and terror, spiritual dread and suffering, the church could offer things that matter precisely because they're not magic. It offers presence, this physically stubborn presence, and it stays when others scatters. It has a language for terror. The Bible and Christianity is full of words that don't shrink fear into embarrassment, and words that let you say, "This is evil," without immediately saying, "So who is to blame?" The church has ritual, but not as this light, meaningless decoration, but as structure, because ritual exists for moments when explanations fail. It gives time shape, and it gives grief a container, and it gives people a way to stand when they cannot solve the problem. And the church has a distinction between affliction and guilt, and that is massive. When a town loses that distinction, it starts treating the afflicted as the suspects, and it starts treating pain as proof of moral defect. And that is exactly how moral panic gets religious. So imagine, Holly, in a world where those four things exist, not rescued from the plot, but held. And imagine in a world where, again, those four things exist. For Derek, he's not excused, but he's seen and he's challenged without being made a symbol. And that's what I mean by spiritual infrastructure. And that's really the show's tragedy, is that Hawkins doesn't seem to have it in any sturdy way. So other things have to take over. Now we return to metal briefly because it fits. And just remember, there are theology sort of essays on videos on here about Christian heavy metal albums, but metal can hold dread without making it respectable. Heavy metal can stare at darkness without immediately converting it into a lesson about manners and politeness. And in a world where church is framed as moral management, heavy metal can end up doing what liturgy used to do, because it gives you a way to say, this is real, this is violent, this is bigger than me, and I'm still standing. But when the story's emotional language drifts towards apocalyptic skies and amplifiers, it's not an insult to faith, it is a comment on the vacuum. When apocalypse becomes embarrassing, something else will carry apocalypse for you. And the show suggests the church, by that point, often didn't. Maybe people will say, this is Hollywood denying Christ, this is an agenda. Sometimes there's hostility, yes, of course, but I think the deeper and more painful reading is this. It's not only rejection, it's also unbelievability. It's the sense that even in a world that's full of Christian residue, of sacrifice and resurrection-shaped returns and costly hope, the church is not imagined as a place where you go when your child is terrified at night. And if that's true, it doesn't only indict Netflix, it indicts whatever church taught the culture that religion is mainly identity, respectability, and policing behavior. Holly and Derek are how the show makes that indictment seem human. So here's the final thought. The introduction of new children is not just a narrative technique, it's part of the unveiling, because it forces the question out of theory and into the bedroom at night. And Holly asks for shelter, and Derek asks for meaning. Vecna offers anti-meaning, as this pain as the destination, and love is a lie, and bond as weakness. And the church, in this story's moral imagination, is not there in any sturdy, credible way. And that is why, to me, the silence is loud, because historically, catastrophe is exactly where Christianity learned to speak, not with triumphalism, but with a trembling steadiness, with mercy, and with presence. So if a culture still borrows moral Christian grammar but cannot imagine the church as credible help, that is not just a secular age problem, it is a church problem. Of course, if you want the foundation for this, then watch part one, which is Stranger Things has a theology of evil, but where is the church? God bless.